Hello guys, this is the last part of your book of the week for third years, The Real Thief. We're going to be finishing this up and you have comprehension questions in your email if that's one of the works you choose to do, and it has some dictionary work, so it would be good to look up some of these words in this story. I know there's been a lot of challenging words, but today we're going to finish reading it. Come hang out with us, grab a pillow, hang out with Nikki and Gabby because they're running around here. Aren't ya? Oh, now you can't see me. We'll get closer. We'll figure it out. We'll get closer here. How's that? Almost. No. How's that? Okay. The Real Thief. This is the last page we're on, I think. He was looking for someone with whom he could share his secret. There must be someone with whom he could discuss his feelings and whom he could show off to. Of course, it would have to be someone small who could fit into his home and see what he was talking about. At noon, he hastened into town, and there he learned about Gawain's trial. They were all talking about it, everywhere. He hurried home and flung himself on his bed. It had never really occurred to him that the robberies would be discovered. He had not let himself think about that. Sometimes he had begun to think about it, but he had quickly pushed the thought aside and his fears with it. As long as he kept the secret, he had felt it would remain a secret. He realized now how unrealistic that had been. He began to anxiously consider Gawain's plight, and his considerations led to the conclusion that the good goose was safe. No one would ever believe that anyone like Gawain had committed a crime. He had everyone's highest esteem, especially the king's. Would anyone have believed that he, Derek, had done it? Would he himself have believed it before it happened? But what if Gawain were found guilty? Well, if Gawain were found guilty, he, Derek the Mouse, would come forward in court and point to himself as the culprit so that justice should prevail. If Gawain were found innocent, which would surely be the case, Derek decided he would keep his mouth shut. He looked about him at his own handiwork. The golden walls seemed somewhat tarnished. The rubies had lost some of their luster. He turned and lay with his face in the burlap. He got some comfort from his own warm breath and from the familiar musty smell of his bed. In the 3 days before the trial, Derek came to realize that he was a thief. And not just a little thief, but a thief on a grand scale. And he had stolen from royalty. Why had he not understood this before? He had not allowed himself to understand it. A trial was being held because a crime had been committed, and he had committed the crime. He looked in his mirror many times. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked as he always had, only sadder, more worried. Did Gawain the goose look like a criminal? Certainly not. Yet he was being brought to trial. It was considered possible that he was guilty. Derek decided that he would confess. He would go straight to the king, make restitution, and take his punishment. Punishment? What punishment? Hanging in the public square? Whipping? Years in a verminous prison on a diet of stale bread and water? Banishment from the kingdom? Or the loss of the king's affection? No, he would not confess. He would confess only if absolutely necessary. Only if Gawain were found guilty. And that wouldn't happen. These and similar ruminations opposed Derek's sleepless nights and weary days until the day of the trial. At the trial, he could hardly believe what was happening. He sat in the corner of a bench alongside the rump of Uriah the pig, clasping his hands together, biting his nails, staring. How could the wise king make such errors of judgment? Girls want a snack? Here's your snack. Here. Here's your snack. There. I brought them a little plate of snack. You can eat. How could the whole community, Gawain's friends, turn against him? Even if he were guilty, were they not still his friends? What kind of friendship were they showing? Why didn't Gawain speak up more, defend himself? Why did he only assert his innocence instead of arguing his case? Derek was convinced that if Gawain hadn't flown out the window, he would finally have come forward and ended the joke, the stupid injustice, by confessing. He had to think that. He shambled home on weak legs and sat down at his rickety table with his head against the Kallikak diamond. Though thoroughly depressed, he was not unmindful of the sensation of the hard, smooth, cool diamond against his soft, furry brow. He wished he could go back in time to the turning point, the moment inside the treasury when he was smitten with the envy of the king's wealth. If history could be unwound and he were there again, he would consider the consequences and he wouldn't steal. Instead, he would go straight to the king, report the existence of the crevice between the two stones in the floor so that it could be cemented. And he would be rewarded in some way, even gain a pleasant prominence in the community. Why had he wanted to be rich or to feel rich? Was he unhappy before? Didn't he see the king himself often looking sad? Wasn't anyone completely happy? Well, Gawain had escaped. He was not being punished. Derek had at least that to be thankful for. He decided to cheer himself up with some music. He got his zither and sat down to play. A few times he strummed lightly on the strings. His plectrum fell from his fingers. He was overpowered by misery. Weeks passed. Derek sat in his hole among the oak roots, not eating, not doing anything, staring at the foolish ducats sticking in his walls. Sometimes he lay like a corpse on his burlap bed, and whenever he was unable to abide his own company a second longer, he went into his room. He went into town. His friend said he looked unwell and ought to see a good doctor. He kept hearing the king's scouts were searching for Gawain all over the forest on the other side of Lake Superb, where he had disappeared. At home, he began wondering about Gawain again. Wherever he was he happy? Derek hadn't faced this question. Now it was plain that he couldn't possibly be happy. Would any innocent creature who had been condemned by society and forced to flee like a criminal? Of course not. He was somewhere all by himself, hurt and in hiding. Derek thought of a scheme to clear the goose's name. He would go on stealing. Then they would realize that they had been mistaken about Gawain. In the next few days he went back to the treasury and stole at random gems, medals, money, whatever, and piled the things up in his home. In town he soon learned that the new thefts had been discovered and that there was no one to blame now because only King Basil had keys. It was a mystery. But at last everyone knew for certain that Gawain was innocent and had suffered a grave injustice. They all went about with their heads hanging in shame. The king was devastated. All he could do was scowl at his prime minister, offer a large reward for whoever discovered the real thief, and double the forces combing the woods for Gawain. Vindicating Gawain was the first good work Derek had done since he'd become a thief. It eased his misery, but only briefly. All he had to do was think of the unhappiness he had caused in the royal household and in all the king's subjects, and realize that the restoring of Gawain's reputation was still no help to Gawain himself, and he fell into paralyzing despair. He had to do something, to accomplish something, to assuage his feelings of guilt. It struck him that he needn't have done more stealing to establish Gawain's innocence. He could just as well have put the stuff back. Little by little, he began carting the loot from his home to the treasury. It was hard labor, but knowing it was the right thing to do gave him strength. He began to eat again so he could work better, and working, in turn, made him hungry. And one day he took down the gold ducats and hauled them back to the treasure house. The next day he brought back all the rubies and the Kallikak diamond. The third day he returned the rest. Gabby's chewing on things. Gabby, no. I have a snack for you. Here. Okay. The news spread quickly through the news. Wherever Derek went, it was being discussed with great wonder and puzzlement in the tavern, on the streets, everywhere. Derek pretended great interest when the subject was broached to him. He also learned that the king's scouts had given up searching for Gawain in the forest. They had decided he was not there, and they were starting to look farther afield. Perhaps their efforts were useless. Perhaps he had flown to a distant land. The return of the treasure did not restore anyone's happiness. After the initial excitement, it hardly seemed to matter. What mattered was what had been done to Gawain. And everyone knew that it had to be righted, or no one would ever feel glad to be himself again. Little thought went to finding the thief. The thief sat in his poor den. Staring at the indentation of the gold ducats he had left on the earthen walls. No, don't chew the brush. Just eat your snack. Here, your snack is right here, silly. Since all the treasure had been returned, perhaps he was no longer a thief, and Gawain's name had been cleared. But he knew that Gawain was miserable. He knew that King Basil was miserable, that everyone in his realm was miserable, and that he, Derek, was the sole cause of it. Tears blurred his eyes. The pall of gloom that hung over the whole kingdom hung thickest over him. Here's the picture of the next chapter. And here, this chapter, the author is going back to Gawain's point of view. When Gawain escaped through the courthouse window and flew high above the town on great wild wing strokes, he looked back below. From the height of the free sky, the king and the crowd gathered around him in the courthouse square looked like frenzied insects. Gawain resolved to get away from them as far as he possibly could. Flying over Lake Superb, he welcomed the coolness of the open air and the vista of the wide forest-bordered waters. But he was a tired goose after his recent ordeals, and he soon used up the energy provided by his anger. When he had crossed the lake, he could go no farther, and he dropped into an open space in the woods. He rested against a hickory tree, breathing heavily and sensing his new surroundings. He had been in many places before, in this forest and in others, but he had not been in this particular spot. It looked strange. It also looked familiar, because it was just a place in a forest. You're spilling your snack. Come on. Those are wild today. When he woke in the morning, he was surprised to see the rhododendron leaves above him. He quickly got his bearings, preened his feathers from the force of habit, and went to look for breakfast. He moved warily by the edge of the lake, since he knew he would be hunted. He found some worms to eat and some tender shoots of forest plants and some succulent bugs. Realizing that he must be careful not to leave tracks, he tied rushes to his webbed feet and walked about, obliterating the imprints he had made in the damp soil at the margin of the lake. As he wandered clumsily in his strange shoes, he thought about the past few days, especially about the day of the trial, and he was sick at heart. He felt he should take off again, continue on his way to some far place, but he was too depressed for such an undertaking. In the woods he came to a cliff, and he found in the side of it a small entrance to a rather large cave. There was a light in the cave, because high above the entrance was a fissure in the jagged rocks that formed a very narrow window. Gawain decided to make this cave his home for the time being, until he was sure exactly what to do, where to go. This decision made, he got busy. With a stick and a flat stone for tools, he dug up some bushes and cleverly planted them in front of the entrance to his new home, so that it would be almost impossible to see. He covered the newly dug earth with dead leaves. No one was likely to notice the narrow window, because of its position and because, from below, it looked like just another crack in the rocks. By lashing logs and sticks together with pliable vines, he managed to make a crude chair and table. He had a home, and he felt sure that the search parties of the king, who were already looking for him in the forest, would not find it. Gawain took up the life of a fugitive and a recluse, with only himself for company. Much as swimming gave him comfort, he would wait for night, when there was little chance of his being seen, to swim in the lake. He wore the rushes on his feet, and he walked, and he searched quickly and furtively for food, always hurrying back with it to his hidden cave. He avoided making a fire, though he often wanted the warmth of one and knew how to rub two sticks together until they ignited. Mostly he stayed in the cave, and he spent his time there brooding, savoring his miseries. He recalled his one-time friends, remembered their looks, their voices, their ways, the warm feeling that had existed among them. However, could they have turned on him, believed him a criminal, even if the evidence did seem to prove it? How he had admired the king! Hadn't he agreed to guard the king's treasure only out of love? Weren't there millions of things he would have preferred to do? Where was the king's gratitude? Gratitude, love, loyalty, friendship. What did such things mean to them? Sifting his bitter recollections, he often wept with his head on his wing at his rude homemade table or stared at the damp stone walls. Sometimes in the middle of the night, in the darkness of his secret cave, he woke up in tears. No, now he knew, if they had ever sincerely loved him, they would have realized it was impossible for him to steal, lie, or cheat in any way. When he was extremely young, a gosling, he had lied in a small, inconsequential matter, only out of fear, and maybe once or twice he had stolen a plum or a penny. But he was no liar, no thief. How he yearned for friendship! How he longed to be in a community with other living souls again. "You are a disgrace to this kingdom." He couldn't forget that cruel sentiment spoken by the king. It stuck in his brain. Why did the world go on being so beautiful in spite of the ugliness he had experienced? The lake was beautiful, serenely beautiful. The forest was beautiful, greenly beautiful. Lake and forest, the whole shimmering world was painfully beautiful. He loved this world, but he was too hurt to enjoy it. The king's scouts passed his hidden doorway many times. Peeping out from the cave, Gawain watched them as they beat about in the underbrush and moved on. He recognized every one of them, and sometimes he wanted to rush out and give himself up just to be able to talk again. After several weeks, they no longer appeared. They were looking elsewhere, and with a new purpose. They wanted to find him only to make amends, but Gawain didn't know that. There you go. He was beginning to get accustomed to his new environment. He made some improvements in his dwelling. He added a footstool and a carpet he wove out of rushes. He still bitterly remembered the injustices he had endured, but he bravely went on living and even managed to enjoy it ever so slightly. Had he been able to share his unhappiness with a friend, he would have been happier. With no one searching for him now, he was more lonesome, but a bit more relaxed. He still wore the rushes tied to his feet, and he still kept a wary eye, but he stayed longer out of his cave and wandered farther into the daylight, studying things such as the great variety of berries, thinking less about himself. He felt fairly safe. One day, extending his researches into a new corner of his domain, he was suddenly confronted with the mouse Derek, who emerged from under a large leaf. Gawain was electrified. He had given up the idea of ever again seeing anyone from his past life. "Gawain!" shouted Derek in his thin, shrill voice. Gawain stood still, fastened to the ground. "Derek!" he whispered hoarsely, staring at his old friend, amazed he could still talk after his long silence. "What are you doing here?" "I've been looking for you," said Derek. Gawain laughed, or rather he made some sounds meant to be laughter. "I suppose you are going to subdue me, put me in irons, and bring me back to justice," he said sarcastically. "Oh, no," said Derek. "The only reason they're still searching for you is that they want to ask for your forgiveness. The king, everyone, they know it wasn't you." After a measure of silence, Gawain asked, "Do they know who it was?" "No," said Derek, "they don't know. But I do. It was me." "You?" "Yes, me," said Derek. "How do they know it wasn't I?" asked Gawain, staring at the little mouse in astonishment. "Because," said Derek, "I went on stealing after you flew away, to establish your innocence." And he told Gawain the whole story of his thieving without malicious intent, his shock at Gawain's being found guilty at the trial, his wanting to confess and being afraid to, his suffering. Sometimes he stopped to cry, and when he found that he was able to cry more in the presence of the one he had wronged than he'd been able to by himself, his little body was racked with sobs. Gawain broke down and cried with him, the hot tears coursing down his neck. He felt so many emotions: joy at having been vindicated and at being with Derek, anger at what had happened, misery that such things could happen, and pity for Derek, bitterness toward his faithless friends and toward the king he had loved, longing for a good life, sweetness at thinking how beautiful it could be, and sorrow that it wasn't so. It was all too much for him. "Can you ever forgive me?" asked Derek, forlorn. Gawain looked at the small mouse cowering by his rush-shod feet. "I forgive you gladly, dear mouse," he said. "I can see how much you've suffered, and we both know what suffering is. But I will never forgive those who used to call themselves my friends. These trees are more my friends than they were, and I'm certain I will never pardon the king." "But they've suffered too," said Derek, "and the king most of all." "Let him suffer, let them all suffer," said Gawain. "I never want to see any of them again." But he did want to see them again. There was nothing he wanted more, and the mouse knew it. He lightly touched Gawain's grooved leg. That did it. Feeling the touch of a fellow creature, the warmth he'd been starved for so long, he relented. "Yes, I do want to see them," he admitted. "I want it very much. I forgive them." "We all make mistakes," said Derek. "Come and see my home," said Gawain. On the way he explained his funny rush footwear. Derek laughed, and Gawain undid the rushes. They had a pleasant meal in the cave and talked of many things. "Why did you look for me here?" Gawain asked, when all the others had given up looking in the woods. "A hunch," said Derek. "I thought you must be terribly dejected, and I knew that in your place I would not have had the heart to fly very far just yet. I guessed you were here hiding somewhere, and I felt I was meant to find you. I rode across this morning. You weren't long in turning up." Gawain laughed. "Of all those who've looked for me, you were the one I was least likely to notice, especially hidden under a leaf. Tell me, are you going to confess?" "Yes," said Derek. "The treasure has been returned, and when I come back with you, they will be so happy they won't want to punish me too severely. But I must be punished for what I did, right?" "I think you have been punished for what you did," said Gawain. "You've suffered more than anyone." "No, you did," said Derek. "You were the one wrongfully blamed." "But you had it on your own conscience that you caused the suffering of so many," said Gawain. "What about the king?" said Derek. "Think what he's been through after judging you so unjustly." Gawain sighed. "Derek," he said, "they must never know who did it. Let them always wonder, and never know the answer. They deserve at least that, for their lack of faith." "I agree," said Derek readily. "Only you and I will know." They started across the lake about midday, Derek riding on Gawain's back. He held on tightly because there was a wind and the water was choppy. They arrived in town at sunset when the lights were being turned on. It was as if the lights were going on to welcome them. When they suddenly appeared, walking up the main avenue to the king's palace like a triumphant army coming to claim its trophies, everyone ran to see them and shouted and cheered and went racing around proclaiming the news to everyone else. They were joyfully received by the king. I will never, from now to eternity, mistrust you again. I repent, he said to Gawain, and he meant it. Please forget it, I beg you, your highness, said Gawain. I forgive. Relieved of his heavy sorrow, the king began crying. He had never cried in public before, but he was unashamed. He embraced Gawain in a mighty loving hug. He embraced Derek with a bit more care. They responded in kind. After a long session together in which they discussed the robbery, the trial, its aftermath, and everyone's feelings, not to mention the various problems of living, as a bear, a goose, a mouse, a king, a subject, Gawain returned to his real home and Derek to his. The whole town slept well that night. A party was held to celebrate Gawain's homecoming and to honor him, and also Derek, who had succeeded in finding him. One by one, Gawain's friends took him aside to ask his forgiveness, and he freely forgave them. He was able to love them again, but he loved them now in a wiser way, knowing their weakness. The king told Derek he intended to give him a reward, but Derek begged him not to. The treasury was now being guarded by 4 bulldogs, the son of Louisa May, who had been named after Gawain, and his 3 brothers, Gabriel, Giles, and Ichabod. The king appointed Gawain to the office of royal architect. Gawain made Derek his assistant and got to work at once on his first project, a new opera house, for which he decided to use his favorite form, the egg. He wanted to make buildings that would be celebrated as great architecture long after his own lifetime. Before starting to work for Gawain, Derek secretly cemented the chink in the floor of the treasury. It wasn't really necessary, but it made him feel better. He felt it put an end to the whole episode, the theft, the trial, its aftermath. There was peace and harmony in the kingdom once again, except for the little troubles that come up every so often, even in the best of circumstances, since nothing is perfect. That is the end. I really like that ending. So that is the end of The Real Thief. Thanks for being here with me, and send me your reading comprehension questions if that's what you're choosing to work on today. Hasta luego.